The Galactic Council chamber was filled with light and sound as delegates from every world gathered to speak about the strange event that had happened near the blue planet called Earth. Rumors had spread that unknown ships had attacked the human homeworld. No one knew who had given the order, but everyone in the chamber could feel the tension growing heavier with every passing minute. The council leader, a tall being with skin like glass, spoke of peace and unity, but the human representatives sat in silence. They had already seen the images: cities in flames, oceans turning black, and the sky full of falling fire. The human ambassador did not speak for a long time. He simply looked at the council members with cold eyes that showed no fear. Then he said that the people of Earth would remember this day forever. On Earth itself, chaos ruled the streets. The first wave of attacks had come without warning. Orbital defense satellites were destroyed before they could respond. Communication lines went silent one after another. Families were torn apart and no one knew if help was coming. The government tried to calm the people, saying it might be an accident or a mistake by some unknown group. But deep inside, everyone knew it was more than that. It was a message sent from someone who wanted to break humanity's spirit. Far away in space, on the command deck of a battle station orbiting Mars, General Laura Hayes stood alone in front of a large screen, showing the burning world below. Her hands were still, her face calm, but her heart felt like fire. She had served the fleet for 20 years. She had seen battles and loss, but she had never imagined seeing Earth attacked. Her second-in-command, Captain Alex Monroe, walked up beside her and said they had confirmed the attackers used council-made weapons. Laura did not answer at first. She kept her eyes on the screen and asked if there was any word from the council. Alex said they had called for an emergency meeting but had given no explanation. Laura nodded slowly and whispered that they would regret this silence. The message from the council came an hour later. It spoke of deep sorrow and confusion. It said that a rogue fleet might have acted without orders and that the council would investigate. Laura read the message twice, her expression unchanged. She then told her officers to prepare a report of all ships near Earth before the attack. She wanted names, coordinates, and every signal trace. Her officers obeyed without question. On Earth, the survivors gathered in shelters and waited for the next strike. Broadcasts showed burning ruins where great cities once stood. Rescue teams from Mars and Luna tried to reach them, but radiation and debris made landing difficult. Children cried as soldiers handed out food and water. There were stories of people who saved strangers, of firefighters who ran into collapsing towers, and of doctors who treated the wounded until they fell from exhaustion. Humanity suffered but did not surrender. When the council sent medical ships, the people refused their help. They had already heard the news that the council fleets near Earth had withdrawn, moments before the attack began. It was too much to believe it was a coincidence. In the military command centers, officers whispered that this was no accident. The council had grown afraid of humans, afraid of how fast they advanced and how much they had achieved in only a century among the stars. Laura Hayes knew that fear well. She had seen how other species watched humans with cautious eyes. They said humans were too emotional, too aggressive, too unpredictable. Now that same fear had turned into an excuse for destruction. Laura's staff worked day and night gathering data. Olivia Grant, the fleet's strategist, found recordings of council ships changing course minutes before the attack. Peter Clark, the chief engineer, recovered black box fragments that showed council identification codes on the missiles that hit Earth. Laura listened to their reports without anger in her voice. She only said that the truth must be clear before any response was made. But deep in her heart, she already knew the answer. She remembered her childhood on Earth, the sound of rain against windows, the laughter of neighbors, the sight of blue skies. Now that world was covered in ash. She could not forgive those who had done this. She stood in her quarters later that night looking out at the stars. Her reflection in the glass looked older than she remembered. She spoke softly to herself, saying that peace was a lie when justice was forgotten. On the next day, the council broadcast their official statement to every world. They blamed a small faction of pirates and promised to bring them to justice. But the images from Earth told a different story. The weapons were too advanced, the attacks too coordinated, the targets too precise. No pirate group could have done this. The people of Earth no longer listened to the council. Across the colonies, miners, scientists, engineers, and soldiers sent messages of unity. They said they would rebuild and protect each other. They said they would never again depend on others for safety. In the council hall, several members began to worry. They had hoped humans would remain calm. They had hoped to keep control through words and promises. Instead, they saw a storm forming. General Laura Hayes was invited to the Council's emergency meeting on Nivara Prime. She traveled there in silence, taking only a small team. When she arrived, hundreds of delegates were already waiting. The hall was vast, full of banners and lights, but it felt cold and hollow. The council leader greeted her politely and thanked her for coming. He spoke of the tragedy and the need for peace. Laura listened quietly until he finished. Then she stepped forward and said that peace cannot be built on lies. She asked the council to show the data from their fleet stationed near Earth. The leader hesitated, then said the data was classified. Laura stared at him for a long moment, then simply said that she understood. She turned and left without another word. Outside the chamber, reporters tried to ask questions, but she walked past them. Her silence spoke louder than any words. When she returned to her ship, she called her officers together and told them that from this moment on, Earth would no longer wait for the Council's truth. They would find it themselves. The ship lifted off from Nivara Prime and entered the dark of space. On the Council world, the delegates argued through the night. Some said humanity must be calmed with gifts and aid. Others said humans were dangerous and must be controlled before they sought revenge. But none of them truly understood what they had awakened. On the bridge of the HSS Liberty, Laura looked out at the stars again and said quietly to Alex Monroe that history would remember this as the day everything changed. Alex asked if she believed the Council was behind it. She said she believed in evidence and she already had enough. The galaxy was silent around them as if waiting. And somewhere on the burning world of Earth, survivors lifted their eyes to the night sky, knowing that someone out there still fought for them. Humanity had been wounded but not broken, and Laura Hayes swore in her heart that one day those responsible would see what it meant to attack the home of humankind. The stars outside the command windows of the HSS Liberty shone cold and distant as General Laura Hayes stood in silence watching them drift by. The damage reports from Earth kept coming in endless lists of destroyed cities, dead families, and lost colonies. The communication from the Council had stopped 2 days ago, and no new message had arrived. Laura understood what that silence meant. It meant they hoped time would bury the truth. She would not let that happen. Around her, the crew worked with quiet determination. The air was filled with the soft hum of machines and the voices of officers reporting updates. Captain Alex Monroe approached holding a tablet with new data from the Sol Defense Network. He said the last signal from the Pacific Command bunker showed their shields failing and then nothing. Laura nodded and told him to forward it to the archives. Then she asked if the colonies had responded to the call for unity. Alex said the Martian Council had already pledged all their ships and Titan had begun producing weapons day and night. Even the smaller outposts near Neptune had sent their mining freighters to be converted into carriers. Humanity was awakening. For the first time since they had joined the Galactic Council, they were no longer divided by politics or pride. They were united by pain. Olivia Grant entered the room carrying a stack of data chips. She was tired, but her eyes were sharp. She said she had analyzed the fragments from the black boxes recovered near the lunar orbit. They confirmed that the missiles were built using Council technology from the Terrace shipyards. Laura asked how sure she was, and Olivia answered that the serial numbers were clear and impossible to fake. Laura took a long breath and said quietly that the Council had made their choice. She walked to the center console and called for a fleet-wide broadcast. Across the human colonies, every ship and outpost received her image. She spoke slowly and clearly, saying that Earth had been attacked and millions had died. She said that the Council had promised peace but had brought only lies. She did not call for revenge. She called for unity. She said every man and woman, every worker, pilot, and scientist had a part to play. She said humanity must stand together or fall apart forever. When the broadcast ended, there was silence for a moment, and then messages began flooding in. Ships volunteered. Factories switched to war production. Even small asteroid settlements offered supplies. No one hesitated. They all knew the truth now. Humanity would defend its home without permission from anyone. Laura turned to Alex and told him to begin forming the defense network. Alex said they could have the new orbital shields ready in 6 weeks if Mars delivered on time. Peter Clark entered the bridge holding a report from the engineering teams. He said the Liberty could be upgraded with new plasma armor within days. Laura approved it and ordered all ships to regroup at Sol System for reorganization. The fleet began to move. Dozens of cruisers, carriers, and small escort ships formed lines across the stars heading toward their home. The sight of the fleet brought hope to the survivors on Earth. In the ruins of cities, people watched the sky and saw distant lights moving together. They knew someone was coming. In the deep halls of the council station, the leaders argued about how to control the situation. Some wanted to send another message of sympathy. Others suggested military intervention before humanity became too strong. The leader of the council, known as the Archon, finally decided to wait. He believed the humans would fight among themselves and fall apart. But far away in the cold of space, the opposite was happening. Laura Hayes spent every hour working with her officers. She rarely slept. She studied maps of council territories and analyzed their patrol routes. She knew they could not fight the entire galaxy, but she also knew fear was a weapon too. She planned to make the council understand that humans could not be broken. Olivia Grant warned her that open war would cost millions more lives. Laura answered that peace without justice was only waiting for the next attack. The crew respected her even when they feared her resolve. Late one night, she walked through the ship's hangar where engineers worked among sparks and noise. Young soldiers saluted as she passed. Many of them had lost families on Earth, but their faces showed no despair. They were ready. She stopped beside a half-repaired fighter and placed her hand on the metal hull. She whispered that they would fight not for power but for home. On Mars, the factories worked without rest. Children carried food to workers and old people helped weld parts. Songs of unity spread through the colonies. They sang of Earth, of oceans and forests, and of returning home stronger than before. Across the network, officers reported full readiness. Laura stood once again on the bridge of the Liberty and gave her next order. All human fleets were to gather near Jupiter for final coordination. The transmission went out and ships began to appear from hyperspace one after another. The sight filled every viewer with pride. The largest fleet in human history was forming. Alex Monroe looked at the map and said they now had over 400 warships and thousands of drones. Laura said it was not enough to win a war, but enough to send a message. Olivia asked what message. Laura replied simply that the message was that humanity still lived. When the council learned of the gathering fleet, they sent a demand to disband it immediately. Laura read the message aloud to her officers and then deleted it without a word. She said that from this moment on, no human ship would take orders from the council. She declared the formation of the Human Defense Union, independent and self-governed. Cheers filled the bridge. Humanity had taken its first step away from the chains of the council. On Earth, the survivors watched the first supply drops from Mars. Food and medicine rained down from the sky in capsules bearing the symbol of the new union. People cried when they saw it. They knew they were no longer forgotten. Laura's fleet moved closer to Earth orbit to oversee the rebuilding efforts. She walked through the observation deck, watching the planet turn slowly below. The scars of the attack were still visible, but there were new lights where cities were being rebuilt. Alex joined her and said he had just received word that the council was calling for peace talks on Navara Prime. Laura smiled faintly and said that peace was easy to speak of after blood was spilled. She told him they would attend, but not as servants. They would attend as equals. The next day, the fleet prepared to leave for the council world. Engineers checked every weapon and shield. Pilots loaded supplies. The Liberty led the formation as it entered hyperspace. On the council world, the delegates waited nervously. Many whispered that bringing human soldiers into their system was a risk, but the Archon insisted it would show trust. When the Liberty emerged near Navara Prime, its presence filled the skies. The planet's orbit shimmered with human ships holding position like silent sentinels. The council tried to appear calm, but deep down they were afraid. The humans were not pleading for justice anymore. They were coming to demand it. Laura Hayes stood on the bridge surrounded by her officers. She looked at the blue and green world ahead and said that this time the council would listen. She said humanity had lost everything but not their will. She turned to her crew and told them that they had one mission now: to make the galaxy understand what it meant to attack their home. The ships of the Human Defense Union floated like silent giants above Navara Prime, their dark metal hulls shining against the light of the twin suns below. The people of the council world watched in fear as the human fleet arrived with calm precision. Each ship held thousands of soldiers and weapons powerful enough to level a continent, but not a single human fired a shot. They came not as conquerors, but as witnesses of what had been done to their home. General Laura Hayes stood in the command deck of the HSS Liberty, watching the planet turn slowly beneath her. She had not slept in 2 days, but her eyes were steady. Captain Alex Monroe approached, and said that the council had agreed to meet at once. Laura nodded and said that they would go, but only with armed guards. Olivia Grant adjusted her uniform and looked uneasy, saying that the council might see it as a threat. Laura replied that they already saw humanity as a threat and nothing could change that now. The shuttle left the Liberty and descended through the clouds escorted by 2 fighter wings. The council's security fleet followed at a distance, ready to react, but no one dared move against them. When Laura stepped onto the landing platform, the noise of thousands of cameras filled the air. Delegates from dozens of worlds stood waiting in the great hall, their eyes following her every step. She walked through the long corridor without saying a word. The walls were covered with banners of peace and unity, but to her they looked like lies made of light. The council leader, known as the Archon, stood at the center of the chamber. His body shimmered like glass. His voice calm as he welcomed her and expressed sorrow for the tragedy that had struck Earth. Laura looked around at the faces of the alien delegates. She saw fear, guilt, and curiosity. She waited until the Archon finished his speech, then said that sorrow without truth was meaningless. The room fell silent. She asked again for the flight data from the fleets that had been near Earth. The Archon hesitated, then claimed the data was lost. Laura stepped forward and placed a data chip on the table. She said that her engineers had already recovered fragments from the debris near Luna, showing that the attack came from council vessels. The delegates began whispering among themselves. The Archon raised his voice, saying the evidence could be forged. Laura replied that humans did not need to forge anything, and that the wreckage of their world was proof enough. A delegate from the Tharn Empire stood and accused humanity of seeking revenge. Laura turned her eyes toward him and said that revenge was for the weak, but justice was for the living. She said they would not rest until the truth was spoken before every world. The Archon tried to calm the room by promising a new investigation, but Laura interrupted, saying that the time for investigations had passed. She pressed a button on her wristpad, and a hologram appeared in the center of the hall. It showed the council ships firing on Earth's orbiting defenses. It showed the burning cities. It showed the exact signatures of the weapons and the names of the commanders who had given the orders. The chamber erupted into chaos. Some delegates shouted in disbelief, others turned away ashamed. The Archon stood frozen, unable to speak. Laura let the silence grow heavy before she said the words that made the galaxy tremble. She said, "You attacked our home." Her voice was calm, but it carried through the entire hall, every word sharp and clear. The guards around her tightened their grip on their rifles. The council guards raised their weapons too, but Laura did not flinch. She said that humanity had believed in peace, believed in unity, and shared their science and their lives with others only to be betrayed. She said that they had been called emotional, reckless, and dangerous. But now the galaxy would see what true restraint looked like, because if humanity had wanted war, the council's stars would already be burning. The Archon finally spoke, saying that war would destroy them all. Laura replied that Earth was already destroyed, and that humans had nothing left to fear. She turned to leave, but the Archon demanded that she stay and negotiate. She stopped at the door and said that negotiation required trust, and the council had burned that bridge when they bombed her planet. She left the hall, and the cameras captured every step of her departure. The broadcast spread across every network in the galaxy. Within hours, every colony and species had seen the human general standing before the most powerful rulers and accusing them of murder. Some races began to question their leaders, asking what else had been hidden from them. On the flight back to the Liberty, Olivia asked if Laura thought they had done the right thing. Laura said she did not think about right or wrong anymore, only about truth. Alex Monroe said the council would not stay silent now and that they might prepare for war. Laura said they already had, and so would humanity. When they returned to orbit, the fleet awaited her orders. The stars around Navara Prime glowed red from the reflection of the ship's engines. Laura walked through the command hall and looked at the faces of her officers. Every one of them stood straight, ready for whatever came next. She told them that humanity's path was now their own, and that they would not retreat or apologize. She said they would show the galaxy what humans could do when united. Alex reported that several smaller races had already sent secret messages offering support. Laura asked why they would risk it. He said they were afraid of the Council too and had suffered under their rule for years. Laura nodded and told him to accept their messages but keep their names hidden for now. The Liberty turned away from Navara Prime, its engines glowing like fire. The fleet followed, moving together in perfect formation. The Council watched them leave, but none dared to stop them. In the council chamber, the Archons sat in silence as the delegates argued. Some wanted to prepare for war. Others wanted to surrender to human demands. The Archon finally said that they would wait and see if the humans truly had the courage to fight an entire galaxy. But far from Navara Prime, Laura Hayes knew that courage was not the problem. She had seen courage in every survivor on Earth, in every child who carried supplies and every engineer who rebuilt their broken ships. She knew humanity had enough courage for 1,000 galaxies. What they lacked was forgiveness. She stood at the observation deck again, watching the stars flow by. She thought of her family who had lived in New York, now gone forever. She thought of the oceans, the forests, and the smell of rain. She promised herself that no other world would ever see Earth's fate repeated. She called her officers and gave the next order. They would prepare the fleet for the coming storm. She said they would strike not for vengeance but for balance. Humanity would no longer bow to any council. Humanity would become the storm itself, and as the Liberty vanished into the dark between the stars, every human in the fleet felt the same fire rise within them. The galaxy had heard their general's words, and nothing would ever be the same again. The stars stretched across the dark void as the human fleet moved through space, silent and steady, carrying the anger and hope of an entire species. General Laura Hayes stood at the front of the command deck of the HSS Liberty, her reflection visible in the glass wall before her. She had seen the reports from every world showing how her words had spread across the galaxy. Some races had begun to rise up against the Council. Others had gone silent, afraid to choose a side. Humanity had done what no other species had dared to do. They had spoken the truth before the rulers of the galaxy, and now the balance of power was shaking. Laura turned to Captain Alex Monroe and asked how long before their next supply convoy arrived. Alex said the ships from Titan were already on their way, carrying new weapons and armor. Laura nodded and said that they would need every piece of it. Soon Olivia Grant entered the room carrying a data pad. She said they had intercepted a council transmission calling for an emergency military buildup across their border worlds. Laura took the pad and read it in silence, then said the council was preparing for war. She asked if the colonies were ready. Olivia said that every factory was producing night and day, and that volunteers were flooding the recruitment centers on Mars, and Laura walked to the tactical map and looked at the glowing stars marking the council systems. She traced her finger over the route leading from Sol to the border of the council space, then stopped and said they would not attack first, but they would be ready. The crew nodded quietly. Peter Clark reported from engineering that the Liberty's new armor was complete and the plasma drives had been upgraded. Laura thanked him and said that the ship would soon be tested. She walked across the bridge looking at her crew, each one working with focus and pride. There was no more fear, only purpose. The humans had been underestimated before, but now every alien fleet commander in the galaxy watched their movements with dread. Far from the human fleet, the council gathered again in their grand chamber. The Archons stood at the center, surrounded by angry delegates shouting over each other. Some demanded an immediate strike to destroy humanity before they could grow stronger. Others warned that such an act would destroy the last pieces of peace left in the galaxy. The Archon raised his shimmering hand and told them that peace was already broken. He said humanity had exposed the weakness of the Council, and if they were not stopped, others would follow their example. He ordered the fleet commanders to form a blockade around human space and prepare to attack if any human ship crossed the line. The Council fleets began to move vast armadas of ships surrounding the solar system like a tightening cage. On Mars, the alarms sounded across every base. The defense networks activated, and human warships moved into formation. Laura Hayes stood before her officers and said that the Council had made their choice. She said that they would not let another attack touch Earth. She told them that every man, woman, and child was counting on them to hold the line. The fleet spread out across the border, forming walls of steel and fire. When the first council ships appeared on sensors, the crew held their breath, but Laura gave no order to fire. The council hailed her, demanding surrender and disarmament. She replied that humans would never surrender again. The council commander warned her that they had the strength of 100 worlds. Laura answered that humans had the strength of one home, and that was enough. The communication ended, and for a moment, space was silent. Then the council ships opened fire. Energy blasts streaked across the void, striking human shields that flared bright blue. The Liberty shook but held steady. Laura gave the order to return fire. Human cannons roared with light. The battle began across 1,000 kilometers of space. The council fleets had more ships, but the humans fought with precision and fury. Every pilot, every gunner, every engineer moved as one. The Liberty led the center line, its cannons burning through enemy shields. One by one, the council ships began to fall. Laura's voice was calm over the comm, telling her officers to hold formation and push forward. The humans fought not for conquest, but for survival. The battle lasted for hours, until finally the council ships began to retreat. Laura ordered her fleet not to chase them. She said the message was clear enough. Humanity would not be broken. The survivors on Earth watched the battle from the skies, cheering as the reports came in. They called it the Day of Defense. The news spread fast through the galaxy. Some races began to celebrate in secret, seeing hope in the humans' victory. Others trembled, fearing what would come next. Laura Hayes returned to her quarters that night, exhausted. She sat by the window looking at the stars, remembering the faces of those who had died. She whispered that they would never be forgotten. Alex Monroe entered quietly and said the fleet was repairing and morale was high. He said the people of Earth wanted her to speak to them. Laura agreed and walked back to the bridge. She stood before the camera and spoke to every human in every colony. She told them that they had faced the full might of the council and had stood their ground. She said that humanity had proven its strength and unity. She said they had fought not out of hate, but because they loved their home. Her voice was steady and filled with quiet pride. Across the colonies, people listened and wept and cheered. Children drew the symbol of the Liberty on walls. Soldiers raised their flags on the ruins, and workers sang songs of the fleet. The galaxy was watching, and for the first time in history, humans were not seen as reckless or emotional. They were seen as unyielding and unbreakable. The Archon saw the recordings and felt fear for the first time. He called his generals and demanded new plans, but none had answers. The humans had changed everything. No one would ever forget what Laura Hayes had said to him in that chamber. The council began to fracture as smaller species started, questioning its authority. Some worlds declared independence, saying they would rather stand with humanity than be ruled by fear. The Archon ordered their suppression, but rebellion spread faster than fleets could respond. The council had started the war, but now they were losing control. Laura saw the reports and knew the tide had turned, but she did not celebrate. She told her officers that victory was not about destroying the council, but about ensuring no one would ever again dare to attack Earth. She said they would strike only where needed to force peace, not domination. Her officers agreed and began planning the next move. The fleet would advance toward the council capital, not to conquer, but to demand surrender. When the order came, every ship prepared in silence. The stars ahead glowed red from the engines of thousands of human vessels. Humanity was coming not with rage, but with resolve. And as the Liberty led the formation forward, Laura Hayes stood at the front of the bridge, her hands clasped behind her back, her eyes on the endless horizon of stars. She thought of the words she would speak when she finally stood before the council again, and she whispered to herself that they would understand at last what it meant to attack their home. The human fleet moved through the dark of space in perfect silence, every ship holding position as if the stars themselves were waiting to see what would happen next. The HSS Liberty led the formation, its hull marked with the scars of the last battle but its lights still shining bright. Inside the command deck, General Laura Hayes stood before the viewing glass, looking at the distant world of Nivara Prime glowing faintly in the distance. It was the heart of the Galactic Council. And soon, it would be the place where the final decision would be made. She had spent years preparing for this moment, and yet she felt no joy or pride, only a deep calm that came from knowing there was no turning back. Captain Alex Monroe approached her with a report saying that all ships were ready for the final operation. Laura asked about the communication channels, and he said they were open to every world in the galaxy. Laura nodded and said that the whole galaxy must see what would happen today. Olivia Grant walked in holding a message from Mars saying that the people were watching and sending their faith and love. Laura smiled softly and said that this was not about revenge but about truth. She turned to the crew and said that they would go forward with honor and that every word and action must show the world what humanity truly was. Not a species of rage, but one of will. The order was given, and the human fleet advanced toward Nivara Prime. The Council fleets waited in orbit there, ships forming a massive wall of metal and light, but none of them fired as the humans came closer. The sight of so many human ships moving together was something no one had ever seen before. Every Council commander hesitated, knowing that one wrong move could start a war that would burn the galaxy. Laura sent a signal to open the communication channel to the Council chamber. The face of the Archon appeared on the screen, his voice calm, but his eyes showing fear. He asked what humanity wanted. Laura answered that they wanted justice and peace, but they would have neither without the truth. The Archon said that war would destroy them all. Laura replied that war had already destroyed her home, and that what she wanted now was an end to the lies. She said she would come down to the Council chamber unarmed, but warned that if any harm came to her, the human fleet would not wait for orders. The Archon agreed to the meeting. The Liberty moved into orbit, and a shuttle carried Laura and a small escort to the surface. As she stepped into the Great Hall again, the memories of the first meeting filled her mind. The same banners of peace hung from the ceiling, but now they looked like ghosts of a broken promise. The same faces watched her, but this time they were silent. She walked to the center of the chamber and stood before the Archon. The light from the ceiling reflected off his glass-like skin, making him look almost transparent. Laura spoke first, saying that the truth could not be hidden any longer. She said that millions had died and millions more had suffered because of fear and pride. She said that the Council had tried to make humanity kneel, but instead had taught them to stand. The Archon replied that what was done could not be undone, and that peace could only be restored through forgiveness. Laura said forgiveness required honesty, and asked him to tell the galaxy who had ordered the attack on Earth. The Archon hesitated, the silence in the chamber stretching for what felt like eternity. Finally, he lowered his head and said that it had been the Council's military branch, acting under the belief that humanity had grown too powerful. He said they had hoped to break human unity before it became a threat. The words echoed through the chamber, broadcast to every screen in every world across the stars. The delegates sat in shock. Some began to weep. Others turned away, unable to face the truth. Laura closed her eyes for a moment and then said that the truth was all she needed. She said that humanity would not seek conquest, but that they would never again take orders from the Council. She said that from this day forward, humanity would stand free, and any world that wished to live without fear could stand with them. The Archon said that the galaxy would fall apart without the Council. Laura replied that maybe it was time for something new, something built on respect, not control. She turned and began to walk away, but stopped at the door and looked back one last time, saying that humanity had been attacked, had been broken, and had risen again stronger than before, and that no power in the galaxy would ever again make them bow. She left the chamber, and outside the crowds of different species filled the streets. They watched her emerge from the building and begin walking toward her shuttle. Slowly they began to cheer, not out of fear but out of respect. The sound grew until it filled the sky. When Laura returned to the Liberty, she stood before her officers and said that it was over. The war had ended not with fire but with truth. The human fleet did not fire a single shot that day, yet it had won the greatest victory in human history. The message of freedom spread like wildfire across the stars. Worlds that had been silent for centuries declared independence. Races that had been slaves to the Council found hope in the humans who had dared to say no. For the first time in galactic history, the Council began to crumble, not from weapons, but from the weight of its own lies. Laura Hayes watched the changes from her ship. She saw new alliances forming, new leaders rising, and she felt a quiet satisfaction. She had not wanted glory or power. She had only wanted to make sure no one would ever again suffer what her people had suffered. She visited Earth months later, walking through the rebuilt streets of New York. The city was alive again, children playing in the parks and ships landing in the distance. She looked at the sky and saw the faint lights of the defense stations orbiting above. She smiled, knowing that humanity had come back stronger than ever. Alex Monroe met her at the old memorial where names of the fallen were carved into the stone. He said the colonies were united now and that the fleet was still growing, but this time not for war. Laura said that the fleet would remain a symbol of protection, not fear. She touched the names on the stone and whispered that they had not died for nothing. Olivia Grant arrived holding a message saying that the Council had been officially dissolved, and that a new alliance was forming, one where every world had equal voice. Laura nodded and said that maybe this time the galaxy would learn what peace truly meant. The wind blew gently through the city and she looked toward the ocean, hearing the waves in the distance. She said quietly that Earth had always been worth fighting for. The camera drones that followed her broadcast the moment across. Every world people saw the human general who had faced the Council and spoken for her species standing on the soil of the world they had tried to destroy. They saw not a conqueror but a protector, a symbol of will and unity. In the coming years, the story of that day would be told again and again across the stars. Children of 100 species would learn about the day. Humanity stood alone and changed everything. And in the quiet halls of the Liberty, Laura Hayes would sometimes stand by the window looking out at the stars, remembering the sound of the Archon's voice admitting the truth, remembering the faces of her people and knowing that the galaxy would never again forget what it meant to attack the home of humankind.